Let me start by welcoming all of you to this event. Uh, some familiar faces from last week's event when we had a number of things happening here. But today I'm really very happy that we're going to be focusing on a topic that I think we will be having a number of events about in the coming years. And that topic really is how we think about the best ways in which we can support fragile states, conflict affected countries in their approach to trying to deal with development. And the fact that all of you are here is because you already probably know that fragile states is where half the world's poor are going to be living in 2030. Fragile states is where some of the most difficult challenges of dealing with not just macro stability or the delivery of development services, but also spillovers from conflict affecting them and populations around them and elsewhere, is the focus of work of many, many institutions. We ourselves just completed a report that's based on the work of a group of about 20 people that we brought together with different backgrounds, policymakers, people who've been thinking about these issues as researchers, academics, trying to see what we could say in terms of the lessons that have been learned in the approach to helping these countries. And there have been many lessons, and there have been a number of efforts that have tried to pull together those lessons. There's been work done by the US government itself in terms of its working groups. There's work done in USAID. More recently, there has work been done by other institutions like USIP did a working group and produced a report, which actually one of the leaders of that exercise, Michèle Flournoy, who is here and who I'll introduce in a minute, was a part of the effort for them to think about it. So I think one of the things that we've drawn from all of this, of course, is that we're still struggling to figure out what are the best ways to tackle these challenges. And today we have two parts to this conversation. The first part, I have an opportunity to spend the remainder of this hour talking with Michèle Flournoy on this set of issues. And she is, as almost, I suspect everybody in this room knows, really one of the people who has played an extraordinary role in the space in two ways. You know, first as a policymaker, as the Undersecretary for Policy in TOD, but also as a thinker about it. And she's been thinking about it before, during, and after her role as a policymaker. It'd be quite interesting to actually ask how her thinking was affected by being a policymaker. That's one of the things that I do want to get into. And so after that, we will have a panel conversation, which Sarah Rose, who's been leading this work for us at CGD, will moderate, and I'll let Sarah introduce the other members of the panel who are very distinguished colleagues also here. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is invite Michèle to come to the stage, and we can begin our conversation. So I guess I kind of stumbled onto my first question as I was introducing you, Michèle, and that's really not a bad place to start. Is you, as I say, you've thought about this set of issues a lot, and then you've been involved in the implementation, and I think it'll be interesting to ask by saying, today now reflecting both on that thinking, on the work you did to pull it together in that task force in terms of, and your experience as a policymaker, what do you think we need to do now to learn the main lessons that would help us get it right better, get it better next time, right? Yeah. Maybe the too ambitious target, but at least get it better next time than we have been able to do historically.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for convening us and for inviting me to participate. It's a really important topic. And where there's lots of experience and lots of lessons learned in this room. But I think there are 2 or 3 things I would say that I think we should have learned, things that would help us do better. One is to think more strategically about the value of investing in prevention. Rather than waiting until something becomes truly a failed state or an absolute crisis, at that point, your decision space is incredibly narrow and the costs of your options are much higher. But if you can figure out how to take a more strategic, proactive approach that tries to anticipate and monitor fragile states and try to intervene, shape, bolster, strengthen, in proactive ways over time, you may be able to avert, the worst outcomes, and you may be able to do it at far less risk and cost. So that first thing is being strategic and focusing on prevention. The second is actually trying from the start to bring together, easier said than done, but try to bring the US government, all of the different components, get them aligned around a strategy and a plan, and a division of labor, and how you're going to have, humanitarian work and capacity building and counter-radicalization and security assistance and development assistance all sort of work together in a coherent approach. And then lastly, and this is probably the hardest, is more robust and flexible funding. The politics of the color of money in this town are really problematic. When members of Congress vote for a defense dollar, it's a patriotic act. When they vote for a diplomacy or a development dollar, it's like, well, why are we, sending money overseas? And, I don't understand what this is for. Not always. I mean, that's a bit of a caricature. But the politics are different. And so we tend to fund military programs very well and non-military tools far less well. And that's a problem when you're trying to take a more integrated approach where, frankly, most of the non-military instruments will be far more important and effective in preventing state failure in the first place.
So I think those 3 things, investing in prevention, whole of government, some interagency, and then kind of having the funding that reflects the need to think about this in an integrated way rather than compartmentalized funding that makes it hard to be flexible. So I guess the interesting question then is, we could say these lessons in some form have been around now for maybe half a dozen years, probably. We were starting to think about them as maybe not as sharp each time you kind of get them better, and yet it seems to be so hard to do them. So let's take the first one, prevention. So we all agree, invest now, save a lot later, much easier to solve the problem. And yet look around the world today and we could say, here's a set of countries where it would be good to invest more now. But building the sort of political support and consensus to actually make that investment first, and second, to invest in ways that actually reflect that fragility in those countries, so that we're not using norms for allocation that sort of rule them out from actually being eligible in many cases, still seems to be quite hard. And I'm kind of wondering, how do you think we might break that political economy logjam of
Yeah, no, it is hard politically because, most leaders in government, they're kind of somewhat slave to the tyranny of the inbox. It's the crisis of the day. And by definition, these things are before they explode in a crisis. And so you're competing, trying to focus on prevention and shaping. You're competing with something that's actually a crisis now, and that's always harder to get attention. I also think that the work on fragile states and stabilization is a little countercultural in terms of the main agencies or organizations that we look to be responsive. So, it's not the sweet spot of traditional development assistance. It's not the sweet spot of traditional capacity building. It's not certainly not the sweet spot of what DoD does. And so sometimes this comes down to kind of almost like bureaucratic culture. And when I know your recent report has made some very specific recommendations about it, this new USAID Bureau. I think one of the biggest challenges they will have, as we've seen when other offices have been started in state, for example, is the risk of the cultural antibodies, the bureaucratic antibodies coming out and saying it's, a foreign intruder, kill it, as opposed to, this is a new innovation that we need to integrate and work with and support and so forth. So I think there's a leadership question, there's a how are people incented and rewarded to behave differently question. And I think one of the biggest obstacles right now is that there is no robust interagency process. It's very broken, right? Probably more broken now than we've had in many years. And so it's very difficult to kind of have a disciplined approach to getting the unity of effort that we need.
Right. And I think, I just want to see whether you agree with this, but I think in a way, when you actually get a crisis, so you're dealing in a conflict case or in a post-conflict context, it's easier to get each agency to accept that its standard rules of engagement don't apply. Mm-hmm. And so they can find common frame within which to work together. Mm-hmm. But if you're in the prevention phase, it's much harder for the people working on that set of fragile states, but not yet having the sort of conflict, although I think increasingly thinking about conflict, post-conflict, it doesn't really make as much sense as it used to. But in those circumstances, it's harder for the people working on those countries or those situations to get the sort of dispensation to work outside their agency norms, and so it becomes harder for them to collaborate. And I don't know whether you would agree with that.
I agree. I think a lot of that is at least suspended or maybe put aside in periods of crisis where we have people in harm's way trying to deal with something. But in the preventative context, much less so. And one thing that I've noticed is the tendency for Congress to reinforce the sort of rules and lanes of the agencies for which they have oversight. Sometimes they're more fierce defenders of agency prerogatives than the agencies are themselves. And we ran into this. I mean, we had a rare instance where, you had a Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates, who wanted to transfer hundreds of millions of dollars to State Department and AID to enable them to be more effective in certain programming areas for the sake of prevention. And the biggest obstacle to that was the Congress in terms of being more protective of agency prerogatives than the agencies themselves were. Well, the agencies saw the need for flexibility, and the Congress basically, was very limited in what they were willing to allow.
Yes, and I wonder if there's anybody here from any of the multilateral agencies like the World Bank or not. But there. So, hi, how are you? Because I was going to say, because I know the World Bank is going through its own strategy review for conflict countries, and exactly the point you raised, it's in the conversations that I've had with people there is that they find once you have a conflict, the building is easier about you're applying a set of norms. But if you're in the prevention phase, as soon as you start saying we have to do things differently, everybody comes up with a reason as to why that would be the beginning, of the slippery slope. And they sort of believe that then all rules will break down and the whole functioning will become harder to explain. So I think you have that same issue.
Yeah.
Probably the guardians of the rules
Yes.
find that they have to step aside a bit when there is a conflict, but less so without. That kind of takes me a bit to the other question, which is working with others. So, one of the lessons has been that you have the interagency approach within a country.
Sure.
But then, of course, you find that in most situations, it's not one country that's going to be
Right.
involved. You have to work with other allies, and they have their own challenges. In your experience, sort of, how you'll rate the pros and cons of being part of a broader
Right.
effort and in terms of the balancing of the complexities that come from it, and then the benefits that come from being able to leverage it. And so maybe.
Yeah, no, I actually think it does complexify the management. I mean, when you build a coalition, an international coalition of stakeholders and agencies and actors, it's obviously a bigger management challenge. But on balance, I think in most cases, much more is brought to the table, and both in terms of the legitimacy of the intervention or the effort, in terms of the division of labor and burden sharing, and usually in terms of the actual capability brought to the table. I mean, a lot of my experience in this was actually more related to, capacity building to counter extremism or terrorism. And we found that when we could sit down with our allies and sit down with other multilateral organizations, turns out, first of all, not only people have somewhat different areas of interest, so there might be an area where it would be very hard to sell our Congress to put a lot of resources into, French-speaking Africa, for example, but the French have no problem, making that more of a priority. So there was sort of a natural division of labor in terms of who was going to take lead in different areas or regions or projects. And then you also look at capability. Well, it turns out other countries and other organizations sometimes are better at doing things that we're not so good at, and vice versa. And so if you have the ability to sit down and kind of map who's bringing what to the table, where do the politics naturally align to support one actor taking more of a leadership role or less of a leadership role, that the sum is sort of greater than the parts, but it does take sitting down, convening, kind of mapping out interests and capabilities, and a lot of negotiation to align people on a common approach and strategy, and then ongoing management of that strategy. And frankly, something we've just seen the absence of and how damaging it is, transparency and communication and predictability. If you're going to be an ally and in coalition, you can't just unilaterally change your mind one day and leave your partners there saying, what just happened? And then, in this case, recent case in harm's way in Syria. So it is harder, but I think usually it's more effective.
Because in the development world, if you look at the sort of mainstream development work that people are doing, I would say today more countries are thinking about spending more of their time and resources and effort bilaterally than multilaterally. So you sort of see that now. And I wonder whether you think that will also be the case in the fragile states effort going forward. I mean, 5 years from now, or if you look ahead, would you say people are recognizing the value of coming together? I mean, Sahel is a very good example where a lot of people are trying to come together under French leadership in some way. Is that the model for the future?
I would hope so. I don't think there are many cases where a strictly bilateral approach or a series of disjointed and separated and not mutually informed bilateral approaches can work very effectively in most of these cases. These are really hard problems that take sustained effort over time, and I think you're much more likely to get results if you've got a coalition that has a set of common interests, has a variety of instruments and funding and effort to bring to bear. I just think the multilateral approach is likely, in this particular type of situation, very complex, very hard to crack cases. I just think the multilateral approach is likely to be more successful. So I hope the sort of bilateralization of some of our development work, I hope that trend does not extend to fragile states, because I think it would undermine our effectiveness.
Yeah. And kind of in a way, a flip side of that is also this conversation around prioritization. So one of the recommendations that came out of the report that you co-chaired was that we need to think more about priorities. Your resources are not endless. We have to sort of decide where to put them, especially because I think the other recommendation coming out of your work earlier on was that you have to think about this as a sustained engagement. So if you want to sustain it, you really have to prioritize. And also, trying to spread yourself too thin just makes for less effective intervention. So intellectually, the case for prioritization is pretty clear and compelling. But every time people try to prioritize, they run into a lot of resistance wherever they try to prioritize, because by definition, prioritization means attaching less importance to something else. And especially if it means prioritizing away from something that people have been doing, it raises a whole bunch of sort of reactions to it. So I'm kind of thinking, how in practice do you think the United States could go about sort of strategically thinking about prioritization? And to what extent is that actually a corollary of this multilateral conversation we've just been having?
No, it should be. And, most states have to prioritize, smaller and middle-sized states, because they don't have the resources to think as globally as we are used to thinking. But I think it goes to the sustainability. If these are very long-term, projects usually. And part of that sustainability means being able to convince American taxpayers and their representatives that this makes sense for us. This is important. And I think for me, it's, can you make an argument about U.S. interests and values being at stake? Can you make an argument about the level of risk if we don't address it, and either in terms of the nature of the consequences or the likelihood of those consequences? Can you make an argument about why U.S. leadership is particularly important? Maybe it's not as important in the Sahel because you have a state like France that's willing to take the lead. But are there cases where absent U.S. leadership, there's not going to be the kind of strength of international response? And then lastly, and I think this is what we are worst at, is a really clear-eyed assessment of the prospects of the assistance actually having the desired impact. And this gets to, are we clear-eyed in assessing the partners, the legitimacy of the government or the folks that we're trying to empower, the conditions on the ground. And this gets to, I think, a lot of the good work you all have done on things like corruption and political marginalization and so forth. But you do have to, part of this has to be some clear-eyed assessment of, are we really positioned, to have the impact that we are aiming for? Or are there conditions that just make it virtually impossible to be successful? And I think that's typically where we don't spend enough time on the sort of problem analysis before we just start reaching for tools and applying them. But I do think it's very hard because, by definition, if you're going to prioritize, you're not only identifying the things you're going to emphasize and put more resources into and more bandwidth and more attention, you're also, by definition, also identifying the places where you're going to pay less attention, you're going to accept and manage a greater degree of risk because you're not going to put as many resources. And that's where people get upset, because the list, I mean, the candidate list is always much longer than the number of states you can realistically manage a serious long-term effort to help.
And I think that the one point that you just made is where I feel that bilaterally or working from a country, maybe working with others, but with the country in the lead, you can do things which is harder for the multilateral system to do, because sometimes you're working in a situation where the partner government is not the route to the solution.
Right.
And it's very hard for a system of international institutions that we've set up, for whom the only door into a country situation is to work through the partner government, and to recognize that, and even to actually have an open conversation about that being a possibility. And so in the fragile states context, sometimes that leadership of the bilaterals become very important in getting the right issue in the right frame for thinking about the problem. I wanted to, I know many people in this room I see have worked on this set of issues, and no doubt have views and questions that they would like to raise with you. So I want to open it up and see if we can get some comments and questions from the floor, and give us a chance to engage with that. So I'll take three at a time. So maybe the here, Jim Michael in the front for a start. Any others? Let's see, there's a lady in the back, and then I'll come back to you. So I'll start with the gentleman in the back first. Maybe you could just identify yourself as well. There's a microphone on its way to you. I was going to go to the gentleman behind Jim first, but then come to Jim later.
Yeah, Tom Stahl, former USAID. I was wondering, recently we've had this Stabilization Assistance Review, which tried to address some of I think, your issues of how do we organize the U.S. government around and division of labor and so on. I was wondering if you think that's a valuable document. Does it lead us in the right direction? What are some shortcomings that it doesn't cover, and whether we've been able to start making use of it?
Yeah,
okay.
no.
Do you want to take maybe three, and then you can, some of them will no doubt overlap, I suspect. Jim.
Okay.
Jim Michael, I'm with the CSIS and an independent consultant. I wonder if you are familiar with the progress of legislation on this subject, and if you have thoughts about whether some of the issues that you've been discussing are adequately addressed in that legislation. For example, flexibility and financing.
Okay, and then the third one was the lady back there. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Sally Paxton from Publish What You Fund. First of all, thanks very much for having this conversation. I think it's great. I was wondering, we've talked at least so far about some of the principles involved, somewhat what the prevention, and then what do you do post-conflict. I'm wondering whether, other than the Sahel, whether there are other examples where the application of these principles either have worked quite well and why, or whether we are better positioned to learn from our failures and figure out, where did we not do it right and why, and what we can learn from that.
Okay.
Wow. Let me start on a couple of these. So I do think the Stabilization Assistance Review was very useful. And one of the things that struck me, whether you look at the work that CNAS and USIP and Carnegie did a couple of years ago, or USIP's more recent report, the Stabilization Review, the State Department's Strategic Prevention Project, the work that you've done, there's a tremendous consensus emerging here. And this ties to the other question, and I think a lot of that consensus is now reflected in the Global Fragility Act, which has been passed by the House and hopefully will be considered by the Senate. And it speaks to many of the themes, all of these speak to many of the themes we've been talking about in terms of prioritizing countries and regions, coming up with more of a strategy, unified effort, strategy, division of labor, flexible funding is a theme, institutionalized learning, evaluation, accountability, the idea of, starting small, and scaling. And so, I do think that a lot of that work has actually informed the legislation. Now, the question on the legislation is whether the funding will follow. I mean, this is a great, authorizing bit of language that says a lot of the right things. It does establish two funds, a stabilization and prevention fund and a complex crises fund. And the question is, will the Appropriations Committee, committees see the infinite wisdom of the authorizers and actually put resources behind the intent. Excuse me. In terms of where I've seen things work well, I think it has been, the occasions where, at least from a U.S. government perspective, there has been an interagency process. There was, at least for a time in the Obama administration, a quarterly effort to anticipate. We went through a list of at-risk, fragile states list, and we tried to identify priority areas and see how conditions were changing and who should be added to the list, taken off the list, et cetera. And then that would spin out into a number of interagency working groups that were actually trying to kind of get a whole of government effort going in each of these cases. And I do think that it was uneven, and actually Jim Shears here, you lived this more than I did, more directly, and maybe you can speak to this. I think there are probably more cases where that was helpful than not. Again, I think the main challenge oftentimes we actually got to a reasonably good place with an interagency plan, and then the challenge was getting the funding to align and getting the authorities and the flexibility that were needed on the Hill. I don't want to just make Capitol Hill the bad guy, because there's plenty of blame to share when we underperform as a country. But sometimes there was just a disconnect between the plan and what it required to get that synergy and that unity of effort, and what, once it was chopped up and flowed through the different committees of jurisdiction, kind of how the sausage came out the other end was often, usually the DoD piece was 100% funded, the Intel piece was 90% funded, the State Department piece was, 50% funded, and the AID was 60%. It was just sort of incoherent at the end of the process, even though we went in with a very coherent plan. So that was my frustration.
So did you want to
Jim,
add
do you want to
something to
comment?
that? Yep, on that point, before we ask the other question? Just
Mainly just to reinforce what our esteemed speaker has highlighted in terms of the challenges. I do think having a broad prioritization and moving into country-focused groups was really important to get the bureaucracy moving, especially I would call it the intra-agency problem, not the inter-agency problem. Whenever you'd focus on a particular country, we were absolutely sure that the ambassador would be on the line for the meeting, which is really important to have the country team connected into the regional offices, both in state and defense. And I also give credit to some of our IC colleagues in the intelligence world who helped to contribute for that. So that was an important plus. That said, going to Capitol Hill, there's the paranoia issue, and that is every time I would use the word flexible, the appropriators would look at me and say, "Oh, that's a slush fund, right? No way." So we actually started to use the adjective agile funding is better than flexible. Anyway, thank you so much.
If I could just add, one of the things that I think particularly in post-conflict situations or in situations where you may have a very, priority military mission like counterterrorism, but it's in the context of a broader civil war or a failing state. Over the last 2 decades, the U.S. most of the senior leadership of the U.S. military have become huge fans and proponents of funding for state and AID and the non-military tools. And I mean, is sort of rather, I don't know what the right word is, maybe too obvious a tactic, but I ended up dragging people like, Dave Petraeus and Stan McChrystal and various combatant commanders up to the Hill to go to the foreign ops appropriation, the foreign affairs committees and the foreign ops appropriations committees to basically say the military who's in harm's way is begging you to please fund these AID and State Department programs because they cannot achieve their mission without robust civilian partnership, and trying to kind of play the patriot political card, which is terrible that we have to do that, but often it worked. And so if it worked to get the money released, great. And it is. I think that in general you'll find DoD very supportive of making the case for state and AID funding.
Well, there's this off-cited quote, if you don't fund the diplomacy, you better be ready to fund more bullets.
Yeah,
so that's,
right.
that's
the
the
Mattis
point, that Mattis quote
yep.
that I think kind of people use a lot. I think it's also the point that you were saying about intra-agency. And I guess that in almost every domain where you're trying to get interagency cooperation, the people who are being assigned the job very quickly come onto the same page. The real problems they have is to get intra-agency support for that line, and how they can carry the rest of their systems with them is clearly what becomes the bottleneck to implementing what otherwise sounds like a very good common approach, when they're in that room. So it's only when they get back to their respective agencies that they end up running into the resistance. Let's see, so I have that gentleman in the back there, Scott, and then I'll come to you, sir.
Generally, my name is Yaya from the United States of Africa 2017 Project Task Force. Usually I don't ask questions, I usually suggest to the people who are on the subject matter.
Is that what you're going to do now?
To question their assumptions or preconceived ideas they have. I'm not talking about the US part, I'm talking about the patient, meaning the fragile states. If you have met me in 1960 to 75, you hear me telling you, listen, these countries in Africa are not viable. So you guys are catching up from us. So if we knew that, and you still pushing the type of strategy or you need to think in terms of legacy thinking, perceptual set, bring those things to what you're doing, and you find out you have to discard the current developmental assumption that you make. Because in economics, there's something called time consistency. Now, the model you're trying to imply in Africa, saying, oh, it worked in Europe and all these other countries, it will be developed, that was a different era. It's not consistent. These countries are too fragile. Yeah. You need to have a political federation, and it's going to happen in 2025.
Great, thank you. I think that's a very interesting point. And I would just come back and say, I guess in some ways you could think about all this continent free trade agreement, you can think about AU, it's all being ways in which you try to build a more larger scale. But Scott, I think you're next, Chip.
Thanks. I'm Scott Morris with CGD. Welcome to the center, Michelle. I want to ask you about China and how you think about China in this context, and particularly at a period of time now in Washington where we have defined China as rival and even threat. And that's sort of the preeminent attitude. But what about sort of thinking of China as responsible partner in these third country contexts?
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's Very important point. Then there's a gentleman there with the hand up, right next to you, something, right here. Okay, no worries. Yeah.
Hi, I am so struck, particularly this week, by the gap between the erudite conversations like this that we see around town and the general political swirl that is out there, and how divorced this discussion strikes me as being from the overall political discourse. And so my question for you is, if and when the time comes that you are back in government, how do you propose to take this particular discussion and reach out to the guy on the corner of Albany and George Street in Dubuque, Iowa, and explain to them how these issues are important to them? How are you going to reach out to that 30% that's out there?
Great. I think that's a very good question. So China, and how do you actually get a broader understanding and support for, what otherwise is a contained conversation that we could be having, but
Yeah.
without much impact?
Yeah.
I think, yeah.
So on China, I mean, obviously, the focus of the U.S. strategy right now is really through the frame of China as a rising power and as a competitor in economic terms, in technological terms, in military terms, even, and some would argue, in ideological terms or government model terms. But I think, and I don't dispute the fact that we're in a more competitive era, and there are places where we need to compete fiercely with China. But there are also places where we need to partner with China, and that China has to be part of the solution, whether it's climate change, whether it's non-proliferation, I would argue support for development. I think the issue that we have with China with regard to development is the model. When China contributes through the World Bank or the UN or through multilateral organizations or NGOs, that's great because they're kind of signing up to global standards and so forth. When we see some of their One Belt, One Road projects sort of pursue an approach to development, which I think is kind of substantively somewhat discredited, sort of focus on building infrastructure without creating any kind of job or new economic activity or sustainable sectors, when it involves massive debt on the part of the host nation, all of the problems that we've seen with some of the One Belt, One Road implementation, I think there we need to be try to drive more transparency about what these deals actually involved. We need to do a better job of offering alternatives for those countries so they don't have to turn to China for a bad deal or a deal that's going to drive them into deep debt and make them beholden. So I think it's, there are areas where this can be a cooperative space for us, and there are areas where we need to compete in the sense of offering a better alternative to some of these countries. Easier said than done. In terms of, making the case domestically, I guess there are several things I would say. When you look at polling data, most Americans still want to see the U.S. as a leader in the world and want to see us shaping the broader environment, and would like to have us deal with problems as far from our shores as possible before they come home to roost. So and also, we're also from a citizenry perspective, there's no country in the world that gives more to humanitarian causes, including humanitarian crises abroad. So I think you can make an appeal to both American interests and values that says, look, if we allow some of these problems to fester, if you allow a state to fail, well, guess what? You can guarantee that an international terrorist organization is going to move in because they love ungoverned spaces. They love spaces where the government doesn't reach and can't control, and they can operate. And those become great places from which they can plan attacks on Americans, our interests, our allies, even our homeland. So I think there are arguments that you can make that connect the dots back to things that people really do kind of care about. And you have to read your audience, whether it's the humanitarian argument, whether it's the extremism, terrorism argument, whether it's the, another one. But, I do think it's possible. And the reason I think it's possible is, like, the only one example, the administration proposed draconian cuts to U.S. development and humanitarian assistance. Every year, the Republican Senate has basically thrown out the administration request and started with the baseline of last year and marked up the funding to keep it relatively stable and even to plus up our humanitarian accounts. So I actually don't think that this administration, the executive branch, is in step with most Americans. I think they're out of step with Americans on this, and I think you're seeing the Congress sort of take corrective action that's more reflective. I think, there's a lot of connecting of dots to make the case, so it's not a simple argument, but I do think we can make compelling arguments to support this that a lot of Americans would support.
But would you also say, Michelle, that I think if you look back, not last 2 years or 3 years or 5 years, but even let's take the last 10 or 15 years, one of the things that we who have worked in either the development space or the fragile state space have not done so well is really made the argument for, we kind of took a little bit for granted, I feel, at least in the development space, why that was a good thing, and assumed that everybody would support it, and found that maybe the world had changed and we weren't making our case effectively enough. So I do feel a little bit that we have to make that case, and you can make the case. I'm fundamentally entirely convinced that you can make that case, but we do need to make it perhaps in ways that we haven't so successfully done in the past.
And also, I think, explain to people how development actually works today. Again, being on the board of CARE, so what, I'll give you an example. We visited a project in Bihar, India, the poorest state in India. It was a project where they basically have dramatically reduced infant mortality with a very simple intervention, training health workers to use antibiotic ointment on the umbilical cord of the baby when it's born. Huge reduction. That project, that initial project, was funded by USAID. Very small dollars, piloted the approach. Then along comes the Gates Foundation and the government of India to now scale that nationwide. Not another US dollar spent. The US dollar was spent demonstrating what works and refining the intervention, and then others paid for it and scaled it. I mean, that to me is the case. You guys say, we're not paying for it all. We're paying for this, we had this huge return on our investment, if you will. And looking at how important a strategic partner India is for the United States of America going forward, I mean, that's a great investment for the United States of America.
All right, I think we have time for maybe one quick round of two questions this time. Lady in the front here, and I'll take one more after that.
Hello, I'm Adelia Gray. I'm a graduate student at George Washington University. Thank you so much for being here. I guess my question is, you mentioned before that policies need to, that there needs to be more robust and flexible funding. So in the future, do you see policies changing to accommodate this? And what do you think needs to be done to make this happen?
Okay, and if there is any others, I will take that. Asma sitting in second row here.
Thank you. Asma Latif with Friends of the World. My question is about the role of national and local in fragile contexts. And as you talk about prevention, how does capacity building, and especially among civil society, play in that?
Okay, so what's prospects for actually having the policies that would allow for the kind of more agile, I think we've sort of given up on the term flexible now, so more agile funding, and then how can you actually see the role of building local capacity in fragile context as part of that, particularly in the prevention phase?
Yeah. So on the flexible funding, I think the key thing is to think creatively about what are the mechanisms that we can use to keep Congress feeling like and actually having some sense of they keep their power of the purse. They keep their ability to decide ultimately what gets funded. And there are different ways that you can do that. You know, we tried dual key authorities, so you had to have both Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State in this case both agree on a program, and then it would go forward. We've tried pooling funding, where you had a fund and DoD would put in 80%, state would have put in 20%, but the ambassador on the ground got to decide how to use the money best. But with a reporting requirement that you had to go back and tell the committees exactly how you spent everything, and then they had a chance to adjust. I think the intelligence community has done very well with a sort of small group that they brief when they need to change things or reallocate resources, because people understand the intelligence world is pretty dynamic and fluid, and they have to make adjustments between annual budgets. So maybe there's a mechanism but we need to do some creative thinking. We can't just show the hand to Congress, say, give us flexible funding. They have prerogatives, and we've got to try to figure out creative ways where they still can exercise those prerogatives, but in a way that's more responsive and agile than kind of annual budget cycles. On capacity building, I think this is absolutely central. I think when you look at success cases, most of them have had very strong and sustained capacity building efforts, where you're building local partners, you're building civil society, you're building checks and balances inside the society, all the precursors to a more responsive, successful government that actually cares about meeting the needs of its people and are able to meet the needs of its people. So I think the capacity building is huge. I think we have more of a mixed record in actually what works, and kind of mixed in terms of, and again, the balance piece, where I think one of the challenges has been, if DoD funding is more sure and reliable, we end up going forward with security assistance and capacity building programs without building the corresponding civilian capacity to direct and oversee those. So, and that's gotten us into trouble in some cases, where you're building a indigenous counterterrorism force or police force, but without the civilian oversight to make sure, even though we train them on rule of law, we train them in all of that, but there's no sort of accountability inside the country to make sure that force stays accountable to the rules that are set by the society.
Okay, now I'm struck by the fact that we have 5 very knowledgeable people in this field sitting in the front row here who've been remarkably quiet. And the secret to that is not that they didn't wish to participate, but I guess they're the ones that are going to be coming up next. We'll have a chance to provide also their perspectives on the conversation we have just had. However, before we get to that, I do want to ask you all to join me in thanking Michèle Flournoy for this very insightful conversation. So,
thank you. Thank you.
All right.
Great, so thank you all very much for sharing a rainy afternoon with us today. I just want to say what a privilege it was to have had the first hour of this event to hear from really one of sort of the great thinkers of our time about how to really create a principled approach to US foreign policy, especially with respect to fragile states. So I just want to, I know she's had to move on, but I just want to say thanks again to Michèle Flournoy and to Masood for orchestrating that great conversation. So for this portion of the event, we get to hear from a subset of our working group members who got together to create a new report that we've just released today called Focusing on Fragility, the Future of U.S. Assistance to Fragile States. And so just a little bit of background here before we launch into that. I think it's sort of worth noting that, lately, the rhetoric that we tend to hear about foreign policy is really shifted a lot in terms of sort of great power competition, which sort of marks a change from a major focus on fragile states that the last two administrations have had as a sort of a central tenet of their foreign policy. But even with that rhetorical shift, fragile states are still extremely important, and there's been a lot of investment very recently, both from the US government as well as from external organizations, in figuring out how to have an external approach to fragile states work better. And so to contribute to that conversation, we convened a working group of about 20 different experts, former officials of the US government, from state, USAID, DoD, the intelligence community, as well as sort of noted academics and policy experts to contribute specific ideas to how the US government can more effectively employ its development assistance in particular, but also in conjunction with its diplomatic and security assistance better in fragile states. And so this working group report was really developed independently of a number of sort of similar contemporaneous efforts. But they all are starting to point in the same direction. I think one of the interesting things that we do end up seeing sort of in these conversations about how to have an approach towards fragile states that's more effective, more coherent, is that there is starting to emerge a lot of convergence around that. And so we find that this working group really sort of complements and builds upon a number of these sort of similar efforts. And so again, today we have 4 members of our working group who will discuss some of the parts of the report. And I'll introduce them briefly, and then we'll get started on our conversation. So I have here Carla Capel. Carla is a distinguished fellow at Georgetown University's Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. And before that, she has had an illustrious career as the vice president at the United States Institute of Peace. She was a chief strategy officer at USAID and the inaugural senior coordinator for gender equality and women's empowerment there, and has also previously been the director for the Institute for Inclusive Security. Next, we have Jude Moore. Jude is a senior policy fellow here at CGD. Before that, he was the Minister of Public Works for the government of Liberia, and also the deputy chief of staff to President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and the head of the President's Delivery Unit. Next to Judy, we have Corinne Graff, who's the Senior Advisor on Conflict Prevention and Fragility at the United States Institute of Peace. She was a senior policy advisor and a member of staff for the Task Force on Violent Extremism in Fragile States that USIP run just earlier this year in February. They released an excellent comprehensive report looking at fragile state issues as well, and Corinne played a central role in that report. Formerly, she was the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Africa at USAID. She was a director at the National Security Council and a senior advisor to the US Permanent Representative to the United Nations. And then finally, we have Jed Devermont, who's the director of the Africa program at the Center for Strategic International Studies. Before joining CSIS, he was the National Intelligence Officer for Africa with the Office of the Director for National Intelligence. He's been at the Central Intelligence Agency as a senior political analyst on sub-Saharan Africa and was a National Security Council director as well. And so we've got a group of real experts here that are going to be able to talk through some of this. In addition to the panelists, though, I want to recognize a number of other working group members who are here in the room today. Several of our working group members don't live in DC and are joining in sort of via webcast, but we have Jim Scheer, Jim Kunder, John Temin, and John Glenn here with us today as well. And then Vijaya Ramachandran, who is a CGD staffer as well, who helped co-lead the working group process with me. So, while aid to fragile states, we found, often seeks to sort of supply technical solutions to symptoms of fragility, fragility is fundamentally a political problem. Right? And so, leaders who choose to maintain their power and their own financial gain through entrenched corruption, through intimidation, through maintaining sort of a narrow political support base, have really strong incentives to keep their institutions weak, and the incentives of aid really can't compete with that. And even reformist governments are often grappling with legacies of exclusionary and weak systems. And in all cases, governments are not monolithic, and so you have governments that have pockets of good governance, good service delivery, within ministries, within particular localities. And so Jed, we heard from Michèle Flournoy earlier that the important question to really ask is, are we clear-eyed in how we assess our partners in terms of thinking about how U.S. assistance can be successful? And so what do you see that the gaps are in how the U.S. government seeks to understand elite incentives to confront or not confront fragility, and how can we do that better?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I don't think we're clear-eyed often. And we could be not talking about fragile states right now. We could be talking about countering violent extremism. We could be talking about food security. But I think that we, work in our think tanks, or we work in the government or in MDBs, and we create this sort of very technical approach, and it looks really good. And the idea is you can just mix, shake, and you have a solution. And we miss the political, which is why I'm so proud of this report. And I think there's really a couple of things that limit our ability to see what's actually happening on the ground. First is mirror imaging. We believe with all our hearts that the governments surely want to address fragility, and indeed, it would be the most important thing that they could do. Well, the reality is that for not all governments, it's the most important thing, and it may have some real costs for them. So, for example, I was in Mali last year, and I was talking to senior government officials, and I said, there's this existential problem you have in central Mali. It's getting worse by any metric. Why don't you think about surging some development assistance there, education? And the senior official said, we're not going to take away our assistance from the south to move to the central region. And I'm not putting a value judgment on that. What he was essentially conveying is that his constituency is in the south, and there are costs to his political objectives and his government's objectives by moving that resources. So I think that the first part is we have to actually think about what are the incentives and disincentives for doing these things. The second one is just information gaps. There unfortunately is a significant overlap between fragile states and small, understaffed embassies. And there's these trade-offs right now about whether or not we're going to put personnel in harm's way, whether it's to get to the roughest part of a capital city or far into field. And so we don't have consistent access to understand these political dynamics. We don't know who the decision makers are in some cases. We don't know who their rivals are. We don't know who their allies are. We may not even know who all the stakeholders are. Let's take a country in the Sahel, and I would press members of the U.S. government in some of these cases to name 25, 30 key influences in these countries. They often can't do it. They can name a president, and a foreign minister, and a finance minister, and maybe a key imam, but it's actually really difficult to get into that second tier, and that's often where the really important sort of dynamics are. So I think that we're operating often from a very limited understanding about these countries. And third, I think it's a capacity challenge. So assume that we have the expert who has developed the picture on this country. How many people have time to actually kind of really read that report? How many people have, the audience for Guinea-Bissau is fairly small, right? And so I think that the problem is that political analysis becomes a snapshot in time. And this is where I'll diverge a little bit from the report. The report says we all need to be singing from the same hymn sheet, and I think that's true. But what happens is we're not going to re-update that hymn sheet because of the cost, and so it becomes a Bible instead, right? It's the only thing that we have, and as time goes on and on and on, it's still our reference point. So a couple things, and I'll be quiet, that I think that we should do, and they're all about process. First of all, I think you need a forcing function. And we kind of have this at different iterations in different governments, but regular updates on sort of a country before an election, before the interagency, and get out the capital, talk to stakeholders, get everyone involved on it. We really need to map the social and political landscape. Two, I think we need a replicable format, so we have to ask the same questions over and over again. And what's really great is create a vignette on how a decision was made, like dissect why that happened, not just sort of name who was critical in that. And then finally, the vigorous debate. Now, as a former intelligence officer, we don't want our analysis to be wrapped up in the policy one, but you can actually build it off that first report and then get a big assessment. And then at that point, kick the tires, question assumptions, and really make sure that you've thought through this piece.
Great. Jude, You were a member of the cabinet of President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in Liberia, and I think this is one of the foremost examples of a reform-oriented government who is, coming on the heels of a legacy of conflict, of more challenges. And so how can donors support the motivations of reformist governments in fragile states?
Sure. Again, good to be here. I think first, I would just piggyback of something Judd said, and that's the political question. You have to realize that even a reform government in most of those places is a coalition government. Well, so you had to bring in actors who are unsavory, but if you were going to form the government, because most of the politics is ethnic, and because there's no one ethnic group that's big enough on its own to be able to win the election, you have to form a coalition of other groups. And in forming that coalition, you have people who are not the best people, but you needed them to be able to form the government. So for example, in Liberia, we have Prince Johnson. He's a senator in the government, in the Senate. And Prince Johnson, if you just typed in Prince Johnson on YouTube, you see some of his works.
Don't watch that video.
Yeah, but he's still a respected senator, and we had to work with him. And so I think you can't be, donors who are trying to help a reformist government cannot be purist in terms of who the actors are that they're going to work with, especially in that. One of the things I wanted to highlight also was that the difficulty of making priorities is just basically because if you're on the ground when everything breaks down, it's the chaos. It's really, really hard to form a priority when everything is broken down. So sometimes that's a bit difficult. And that's why the process for donors, it has to be multilateral. It's a long and expensive process. At one point, we had 16,000 UN peacekeepers in Liberia. They were there for more than a decade. That's so expensive, but that was the cost at which we were able to stabilize a fragile country. And so if it's just one country, it becomes really, really hard to be able to do that. And then different partners will specialize in terms of what they do best. So in the US, took responsibility of the military, and they had DynCorp to do it, right? And so in the end, that military was probably the best the country had ever had in terms of its training, its composition. Every soldier had at least a high school education. Every officer had at least an undergraduate degree. And in terms of female participation in the military. But then the Indians were really good with the police. And so they took responsibility for that. So I think having a multilateral process and specializing allows each donor partner, especially for reformist government, to help them to be able to do it. And the final piece I would say is that the interventions have to support systemic change. And what do I mean by that? And this is the example that I gave during the conversations about, there's this question that is asked of African militaries. Out in the field, if a child, a little boy, a little girl, sees a soldier, do they run toward them or away from them? Right, in terms of how citizens, how people perceive the military. And so if you're going for systemic change, you want to be able to change, to alter that. So in Liberia, the military had a whole unit that was basically just engineering. And all they did was fix roads because the country had infrastructure there. So for the first time, people saw the military without guns, but actually in a civil process, doing civil works, and it changed people's perceptions of what the military is and what. But this is why the multilateral system is really good, because even though the military was trained by DynCorp, the equipment that they used in terms of the engineering unit was supplied by the Chinese. And so I want to come back to the question of China. It is clear that there are spheres in which China is really a strategic competitor to the United States. And in those areas, yeah, I mean, definitely. But China's expansive Belt and Road Initiative, Morgan Stanley predicts that by 2025, it will be about $1 trillion. That is across multiple fragile and failing states. It makes China a stakeholder in maintaining the peace. And so outside of America's framing of China as a strategic competitor, there is still space for collaboration. And what we saw in Liberia is an example of that. And so if donors are going to help countries, especially reform-minded countries, I think this framing would be very useful.
Great, thank you. So on the theme of sort of the political roots of fragility, one of the things that means actually is that fragility is often very deeply entrenched in a country, much more entrenched than can be addressed in a single administration, for instance. And then symptoms sort of fragility spread throughout institutions and even through social structures, and again, these don't change quickly. And so, Corinne, one of the things that some of your work is focused on is thinking about expectations for success too. And so how should donors think about calibrating expectations about what external support can reasonably accomplish, and what policies and processes can help match how the US government engages with like a realistic kind of time frame?
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you for having me and having me be part of this process. So the report that I've worked on for the past year or two at USIP on focusing on a slightly different topic, which is fragility as it relates to violent extremism, touched on some of these issues as well. And I think the question of donor expectations and the expectations of actors outside fragile states is a really important one. And I think is being grappled with more and more, and there is a consensus that's building as part of this convergence that others have been talking about. I think one of the things that strikes me as most important in that respect is the focus on M&E, monitoring and evaluation, of our engagement in fragile states and our programs, but with a different lens than we do with traditional development assistance, and really shifting to focus more on learning than necessarily outcomes. I think that's something that you see in the Global Fragility Act, but if you want to do this really robustly, what does that look like? What are the learning benchmarks that we're looking at? The Alliance for Peacebuilding is doing a lot of work on this. I think it just requires a completely different mindset. But I think it's really important and significant per the conversations we've been having about the relationship with Congress, that Congress is starting to recognize that the focus on learning may be just as important, if not more important, than the focus on outcomes, because that hasn't been the experience with development assistance in other sectors, in more technical sectors like health and food security. So it requires a really a big shift, and I think the fact that we're starting to see this in Congress is very significant. I see a lot of colleagues here with a lot of experience, including some from CSO at the State Department, and I know CSO is doing a lot of work on this as part of the Stabilization Assistance Review, and we at USIP are very focused on this as well, the learning agenda. But I wouldn't underestimate the extent to which that's important in helping us to set expectations, so we're not looking for results in the next budget cycle or in the 3-year budget cycle that the World Bank sets. So to me, that's one of the most important things to help us as donors set more realistic expectations. I think a second is to stay focused on a development best practice, which is selectivity, which development actors and donors have absorbed and are implementing and acting on in other sectors. That's harder to do when you're talking about fragile states, because so many actors are engaging in those countries for national security, for security reasons, and not necessarily for development reasons or in reaction to a crisis where you go in and there's less focus on selectivity. But I think it's still possible to do in fragile states, and so thinking about that, the Escaping the Fragility Trap report that the Cameron Commission released a couple of years is very focused on this, and the idea of looking for moments of opportunity in fragile states when we are more likely to see progress on political reforms. So whether it's around an election, a different kind of transfer of power, a peace process, but being better at looking for those moments of opportunity in those countries, I think, and more systematic about it is really important. And then I think the time horizon that you mentioned, Sarah, is also critical. And I think that's also part of the shift that we're seeing with the focus on learning, which is we're not looking at the next budget cycle. We're not necessarily even looking at the next 5 years. We're looking at the next 10 years or the next generation in some of these countries as far as really seeing results and progress. And I think that is getting absorbed into the system, which I think is really important as well.
Thank you. So because CGD is a global development-focused think tank, I would say there was an outsized emphasis in our report on looking at USAID, because institutionally, if you're looking at development, then USAID is really the key player here. And so I do have a couple of specific sort of points and questions I'd love to ask about USAID. And Carla, you were there in a very senior role. And so I would like to ask of you, so in fragile states, a really significant portion of aid to fragile states goes to specific sectors like health, like education, like agriculture. And many times these kinds of interventions that are being funded interact with the drivers of fragility. Yet programs aren't always designed with a good understanding of these interactions, or nor do they have sort of explicit fragility conscious goals like building social cohesion. So Carla, how can USAID better calibrate its sort of typical sector-based approaches to sort of address or work with the challenges of fragility?
First of all, thanks for including me with the working group. Thanks for having the working group. And I want to say, Jim, Tom, feel free to correct me or fill in gaps. You are as qualified, if not more, to be part of this conversation. I think that some of the challenges that USAID faces are challenges that any big bureaucracy faces, which is that the organization is decentralized, the programs are stovepiped, and that makes it really hard to do crosswalking. Add to that other challenges that are specific to the work within USAID. So, for example, we have the move towards the creation of this new bureau, and I think that's wonderful. But how that then suffuses itself into the rest of the bureaucracy and the experts working in different areas remains to be seen. And that can be very difficult, both because the organization was initially structured really to deal with a set of stable developing nations that would progress through stages of development, and those were somewhat predictable. And now we're dealing with a world in which increasingly the countries that are aid-assisted countries are fragile states, and that calls for different kinds of interventions. And that's true, notwithstanding a growing consensus, which we heard from Michèle Flournoy and others here, around issues relating to fragility, but in the absence of catch-up within the organizational hierarchy. I think that the other issue is that we don't really yet incorporate a risk analysis into the planning that we're doing. We're looking at long-term planning horizons, and yet we're not pulling that risk assessment and risk analysis into all of those assessments. And we're also not necessarily paying much attention to all of the dimensions of diversity within these societies. And Jude was just talking about ethnicity and how that boils down, tracking that against where we're making those investments and being able to tailor those on a short time horizon to enable us to sort of conflict-proof investments in real time. So those are some of the complications. I think there are others, and I know we'll get to those in the discussion later on, but it gives a sense of how difficult it is to move within an environment of greater complexity when you have a somewhat static, slow-moving bureaucracy.
So I want to pick up here for a minute, too, on the conversation between Masoud and Michèle Flournoy about interagency policy coherence. So as they outlined very clearly, part of the problem with U.S. policy towards fragile states has been that the development approaches, defense approaches, diplomatic approaches have sometimes been siloed and not very well integrated. There's a number of mechanisms, of course, to promote interagency coordination, but as you heard, Michèle Flournoy characterized these as broken in some ways. And so Judd, you've been highly involved in a lot of these interagency processes. So when do they work well? And what continue to be the stumbling blocks into getting better interagency coordination for particular issues related to fragile states?
So it's my view that a successful interagency policy has two things. It has a champion and it has an implementer. You need both of these to work, right? So the champions are usually here in Washington. They're Michèle Flournoy. They're cabinet level. They're undersecretary, deputies. These are the people who are going to address Jim's intra-agency problems as much as the interagency problems. They're the ones that provide the top cover, that adjudicate problem sets, that move money, that take the meetings, that travel out. You actually really need them. They're typically very good at being closers as well. And then you need the implementers. Obviously, more important than the champions, you can have you need both, but implementers are more important. And that's usually the embassy and then the working level here in Washington. And I can tell you, if you don't have the implementers, it's not going to get done. As a former NSC director, I can tell you, I can't want it more than the implementing team. And so when you have a strong embassy and a strong interagency, I think you can get a number of these problem sets done. And just my own experience working in Somalia, I won't tell you the country that I had a harder time working. We had a phenomenal team in the field. We had champions from Wendy Sherman at State to John Brennan and Dennis McDonough at the NSC. And we had all the interagency engaged on this, working in the region. And it was a period where, even though it was in the midst of the Somali famine, we were able to roll back Shabaab, recognize the new government, rehab the Kenyans. I mean, we were moving with speed, and I think because we were all had a shared sense of the analysis, and we had sort of that top and bottom movement. What continues to be stumbling blocks, and I'll just sort of pose them in questions, is I still have a hard time trying to figure out what it means to work on a fragile state, right? And I think the report says this really well, is almost anything can be addressed as addressing fragility, addressing the symptoms or the roots, and every single agency, has its own plan or strategy. And I think that when you get to a place where there's all of these documents that they're not duplicative all the time, they overlap, I think that makes it really challenging when there's a disagreement or at least a nuance about what we're talking about. Prioritization is the second question, and I think Michèle and Masoud really hit this well. This is a hard nut to tackle, right? And difficult to measure success or failure, and hard to operationalize. And it almost always takes a backseat to almost everything else, right? Everything else is more urgent than dealing with the systemic problem. And you aren't going to have an emergency meeting on a state fragility issue, right? Like if you have an emergency meeting, like the problem is way beyond the preventative side of the house. And then lastly is, what is the right interagency coordination mechanism? Michèle alluded to it. I think that there was something working. I actually think the APB was even a better case study of where we had some processes that were country specific, and then this functional group of folks that would flag countries where we worried about atrocity, and then they would those processes would merge. And I think we had that in fits and starts on the fragility side as well. But I think that we can be agnostic about the way in which we do it, as long as there's some cross-pollination, and ultimately these things merge where we're kind of moving in the same direction.
Great. So Carla, I'm going to come back to you again on some more of our USAID issues too. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I think that Michèle Flournoy and Masoud talked about quite a bit were sort of the tools and the things that are available to particular agencies in order to work in a particular kind of way. And this includes like authorities, ways that are the tools that USAID in particular can use for programming, but it also includes the people too, and what sort of the staffing structures kind of look like. And so I guess in your perspective, what does USAID need to be able to operate more agilely, more flexibly in fragile states in terms of funding, culture, authorities, and then how does USAID's foreign service need to evolve to be able to match the challenges of fragility?
So I think that there are a number of structural impediments that AID has been trying to tackle over the last several years, but it's really hard to do that. So, for example, as I mentioned, USAID used to be working in these stable countries, and people would rotate from one to the other. And what we realized this a few years ago, was that suddenly they were going to places like Afghanistan and really serving in volatile and difficult environments and coming out. And we weren't really equipped as an organization when I was there to help them manage the process of moving from essentially kinetic environments to stable environments, and how to provide all of that support. And there's been a big attempt to move forward with plans for increasing the ability to provide that, but it brings with it a whole set of needs that weren't originally necessary. It changes the cadence of rotation within countries, which by its nature then changes the entire process of managing and working with foreign service officers. And so I think there's a real need to reinforce that, and also to learn from organizations within the US government and elsewhere that are better used to dealing with conflict environments and fragile states, and to helping people work within and rotate through those settings. I think the second is we need to recognize, and this has been alluded to a little bit in the conversation, but more explicitly, the need to provide support that crosses sectors. So currently, a lot of the allocation of personnel is based on the allocation of resources. So if you have a lot of money that is health sector money, then you put health officers there. But you may need governance experts to be supporting the folks who are working in the health sector. And that requires you being able to put in a governance expert. And yet most of our allocation of personnel is based on where the large amounts of resources are, and you need teams that are cross-functional. And so there needs to be a way to enable you to provide expertise even when there isn't a big program labeled governance program, so that you're able to react to needs on the ground that may be cross-sectoral needs and require a different sort of expertise than somebody who is fabulous at putting a vaccination program there, but is now dealing with health sector strengthening. So I think that's a second piece. I think the third is this consensus around fragile states and the emergence of fragile states as a large share of the developing countries and emerging economies is relatively new. And so you have a group of career experts who are extremely smart and capable, but didn't get the kind of formative training to know how to work in these environments and what is different and what is the same, and then how do you move forward based on that. And so you need to enable the kind of retraining or supplemental training that's necessary to create that capacity. You need to be able to hire people that have been educated in that way, and you need to make sure, frankly, that the educational system for people who are coming into the workforce today have the basis and the training necessary to move that agenda forward. And I will end on that note, since I'm in an educational institution now and really looking at how do you help those institutions evolve. I'm not sure that those skills and tools are really being embedded even into the next generation of sector professionals that's emerging now. And so that means we're going to be behind all of these great reports and sets of recommendations still are not being folded into the people who are merging to work into the field. So I think there's a lot that needs to be done, both for those who are currently in USAID and other organizations, and those who are going to be graduating and coming into them in the next 5 and 10 years.
Yeah, that's really critical, because it is the people who set the policies and are actually doing the work on the ground as well. So I'm going to take a minute to shift away from development assistance to the world of security assistance. And so, again, CGD is largely a development-focused think tank, but how security assistance is delivered matters enormously for development assistance, and vice versa. They both matter a lot, sort of, for their mutual effectiveness. So given that active conflict or a heightened risk of conflict are present in many fragile states, there's often a security component to investments there. And strengthening security alone really isn't sort of a sufficient condition for being able to address root causes of violence, however. And so it's really much more important to understand sort of how security forces operate within sort of their political and governance context. And so the working group highlighted a couple of things with respect to security sector assistance. And one is really sort of fundamentally that there's very little evidence right now about whether and to what extent and under what conditions security sector assistance has really been effective in achieving its goals. Typically, these programs have not been rigorously evaluated. I think there's some encouraging movement in this direction with the new assessment, monitoring, and evaluation policies that have been put in place by Congress, and there's policies that are moving that forward. But again, it's a work in progress still, especially with the Department of Defense. The working group also highlighted the importance of defense institution building in terms of investing in the professionalization of the security sector. But one area that the group delved into, which Jude touched upon earlier, and I'm going to ask him to expand a little bit more upon this, was the potentially useful role of support for developing these civil engineering units that Jude mentioned as part of fragile state armed forces. This builds on earlier writings that Jim Shear, one of our working group members, has done and has been thinking a lot about and recommending for some time. in terms of how these units can be sort of instrumental, in particular reformist governments who, in terms of sort of complementing how the role of the state is perceived. And so, Judy, again, you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I wanted to hear a little bit more about your experience from Liberia and tell us a little bit more about what U.S. support for the Liberian civil engineering units looked like, and then sort of how that played a role in helping, as you say, sort of shift that perception.
Sure, and just quickly before I wanted to just make a comment on something she said about expectations, and the expectations piece is that sometimes the values, right. So for example, in Sudan at the moment, one of the actors in the piece is complicit in some of the worst things that happened, but that is the cost of the stability. And sometimes if the donors, if the partners insist on every single actor who was somehow complicit in something should be pulled out, it's almost impossible for you to be able to have the peace. So in Liberia, I would say that with the military, it was slightly easier because in a lot of other spaces, former soldiers, former militias are brought into the new military. There was an agreement, and so a very important piece is some sort of elite consensus on what the process is going to be like going forward. And like our neighbors to the east, Côte d'Ivoire, they're at peace now. But every time I've gone to Côte d'Ivoire, there's always this question about it doesn't seem yet an elite consensus on what power and the transition would be like. And so if you have that, it becomes easier to be able to do. So in Liberia, every fighting force was disbanded. And people who had roles in the first, in militias and rebel groups were vetted, and those who were adjudged to have committed atrocities of any kind had no place in the new military. The second thing was that because they insisted on everybody in the new military having at least a high school education, well, a lot of the people in the militias didn't get a chance to go to high school, so not many of them qualified. It was younger people who'd come from maybe refugee camps or had been internally displaced who were recruited. And so first, by making an effort to keep the military free of people who had troubled past, helped in terms of the perception of the military. There was a coup before the war, and so for a long time in that country, perceptions of the military had been negative. Like the example I gave of the child to seize the soldier, if he sees the soldier as a protector or someone who would harm them. And so having the military participate in civil works, in things that were not usually associated with military, helped in terms of rebuilding. Because a part of it wasn't, I mean, when a country is broken, it's not simply the physical structures that are broken, there's also the social fabric of the society that's been broken. So you're rebuilding all of that. And so how people perceive this new army in terms of and for most of our countries, wars aren't between countries. The breakdown occurs within countries. So really, in my opinion, is mostly what we need is actually police and not armies. And so, but that doesn't tend to be the case because, you know, dictators like to deploy the army against people protesting. Anyway, so by assigning such a prominent role, and because you have to remember also that the infrastructure in the country had been broken, and so people seeing the military and the military perceiving itself as having this role in civil parts of governance, I think changed the perception of the Liberian people toward the military and the military toward them. To such an extent that there was a riot in December of, I don't know, maybe 2015. But at the end of the year, there's this big program to do food for work. So it's students, and they make money so that they have money in their pockets for Christmas. And the payment, instead of using mobile money, and they decided to pay them in cash, and the payment system broke down. And the students, I guess, the entire country, all of us are still traumatized. But the students went on a rampage and burned things, cars and stuff like that. And the entire city just looked like some sort of hurricane had gone through. And the cleanup was done by the military. It was the soldiers who came and did the cleanup. And so, but by that point, by 2015, people had become accustomed to seeing soldiers do things that were not military related. And so I think in terms of building the culture where there's an understanding of civilian subordination to the military subordination to civilian authority, seeing the military acting in civil spaces helped rebuilding the fabric beyond the physical destruction in terms of rebuilding the fabric of the society after the war.
Thanks. And this example I think really does sort of highlight back to what we talked about at the very beginning, that it really does come down to sort of the political settlement and sort of what the politics are in a particular country too. Because I know back in the earlier part of the last century, the United States was actually helping the Colombian military to do a number of these kinds of efforts as well in terms of digging wells and repairing infrastructure. But in the absence of sort of the peace accord that would then come later to actually have a constitutional referendum to make it a much more sort of inclusive kind of political environment. It was largely just window dressing and didn't do anything itself to alter the social compact. But in a place like Liberia, when there was the reformist government in place, that kind of thing could be useful. So I'm conscious of our time. I want to make sure you guys have time to ask some questions as well. But Corinne, I was hoping that you might be able to sort of pull it together in a sense, because as we mentioned earlier, there's a lot of pieces that have been pointing in the same direction about this whole big conversation about fragile states. There's the Stabilization Assistance Review, there's the State Department Strategic Prevention Project, there's the recent USIP report, again, that you played a major role in. There's the Global Fragility Act making its way through Congress, and again, USAID has undertaken some structural reforms as well as more fundamental reforms to focus more on conflict prevention as well as stabilization. And so, what are some of the common themes and complementary ideas that you see emerging in all of those things, as well as this working group report that, again, thank you very much for participating on? And sort of what are the most important areas of convergence that you see?
Thank you, Sarah. And I think there are three to my mind. We all may have a different answer to that question, but to me there are three. The first is putting politics at the center of the fragility agenda. The second is the need to focus still on coordination, interagency coordination in particular. And the third is the need, and that's related to the second, to encompass and look at security assistance and not just what we're doing on the civilian side. So on the politics, we've talked a lot about this. There's a lot of discussion. We're also late in the day, so I'm going to say something provocative, which is I actually think there has been a lot of progress, and that the convergence we're seeing is new and significant. There are a number of different countries and donors. It's not just the UN, it's also the World Bank, the ones that are less likely to focus on the underlying politics of these issues. A number of donors in the US, the Stabilization Assistance Review, the Strategic Prevention Project, and to some extent the Global Fragility Act, all are really putting politics at the center of the fragility agenda in a way that I haven't seen before. I know there are a lot of people in this room who've worked on fragility for a long time, so I'd be curious if they agree. But I think that's new. We're seeing, for example, one of the best examples, I think, is the UK Stabilization Unit's new approach or take on this to really hone in on the configurations of power that are sustaining elites in fragile states, how you change the incentives of those elites, and what are the implications of all of our policies on those configurations of power. So I think there's really a consensus. That said, we still have to walk the talk. Both the Stabilization Assistance Review, Strategic Prevention Project talk about this, but do we all have the same understanding of what does it mean to focus on the politics and to adopt an approach that really reflects that? And I think that's where there's still more work to be done. And I think in some areas of policy, for example, sanctions policy, you're seeing a lot of progress on this issue, with sanctions focusing more and more on economic sanctions, corruption, and kind of widening the aperture of how we use sanctions. I don't think that same level of progress is happening in the development community and with development policy. I think it's still very targeted, focused on conflict mitigation, and that actually is typically fairly small budgets, and that we need to do a lot more in the development community to absorb the implications of that and what that means for the areas where we invest the most. As we've already talked about today, but global health, and how are we using those funds to address those fragility dynamics and the places where we're investing the most. So I think there's still a paradigm shift that's needed in the development community. We're talking about it, but I don't see that shift happening yet. And so I think there's still a lot of work. On the interagency coordination, that's a topic that came up. It's come up a lot today. It came up a lot in this task force that I worked on. And for me, the bottom line was, it's a huge challenge. This report recommends a whole of government strategy, which I think is important. I agree with Judd, and I like your framework of champions and implementers. Our task force recommended a new Deputy National Security Advisor for prevention and suggested that that was the level of championship that you needed to really make progress on this agenda. It made a lot of sense if you think about it. The 9/11 Commission report, the co-chairs of the task force that I worked on was chaired by the co-chairs of the 9/11 Commission, had 3 parts to it. One was focused on counterterrorism and kind of what we're doing internationally, the other Homeland Security, and the third was prevention. We have 2 Deputy National Security Advisors now. So if you think about it, a third makes a lot of sense and really is the level of leadership that you probably need because it's so difficult. And the task force co-chairs of the task force that I worked on repeated this at length, that do not estimate how difficult this is. Everyone's talking about it. That doesn't mean we're anywhere near what we need to do. And I thought that was really good insight. And then the third, the focus on security assistance, we've talked a lot about it today. I would reference a report that I like to reference by UNDP, The Journey to Extremism, which really highlights the extent to which citizens are coming into contact with security services. And so if you're not focusing on that, it's unclear how you can really get at fragility and if what you're doing on the civilian assistance side can't get to that. And so I think that is critical. And again, I do think we're making progress because I don't think we would be having this conversation 10 or 20 years ago. I think there's a new willingness to accept that this is the way we really need to go.
Thank you very much. And with that, I'll open up to the audience for any additional questions for the panelists here today. So we have microphones roaming around. We'll take 3 at a time. Let's do. Yes.
Hi, thank you all for being here today. I appreciate the conversation. My name is Brett Alexander. I'm from World Vision. And my question is, I get putting politics at the center of the fragility debate, but a lot of the conversation we've had today is centering on fragility equals conflict, and that's not always the case. So could you speak a little bit about how putting politics at the center of environmental fragility or societal fragility has a role to play in a lot of our conversations that do not exist in the security assistance space?
Hi, thank you so much for being here today. My question is, we've seen that the nature of conflict has changed a lot over the past, decades. And my question to you all is, how do you think the international development sector is adapting to those kinds of changes? Because we can see that the nature of conflict is just so much different in how it's implemented.
Thank you. Hello. I'm Kibi Kim from Asian Development Bank. And Mr. Moore said outside of the U.S. framework for assistance, there's room for collaboration between U.S. and China. However, we've been looking at the escalation of tension between the 2 countries in terms of trade war. Then how can we achieve collaboration with China? Would Chinese people will be willing to support U.S. side? And this is a follow-up question. Would there be room for multilateral development banks and international organizations to intervene in the situation and move forward to making a new development framework? Thank you.
So we can tackle those 3 briefly, and then maybe if we have time, have one more round.
Sorry, it was the last question?
Looking at like U.S.-China cooperation.
If it's possible.
Is it possible?
And then the role of multilateral development banks in changing in a new development paradigm.
Right, exactly.
Framework.
So we have What about how do you think about politics for fragility that's not conflict-based in terms of social fragility, environmental fragility, et cetera? How is the changing nature of how is sort of the development how is the changing nature of conflict influencing sort of development policy towards these kinds of issues? And then, as Judy said, the role of U.S.-China cooperation, and is there room for a multilateral strategy to address these things? So, sure. Okay.
So I agree that fragility and conflict are two separate concepts and things. I think putting politics at the center of fragility applies to fragility in other sectors because it's about governance. And I think looking at it that way reframes the task for policymakers. So it's less about the technical viability of the policies, whether it's conservation or food security, and it's more about how the issues are being managed by the governing system or processes in the country. And I think that applies to the issues that you mentioned as well. So I would see those as linked still in these other sectors. The changing nature of conflict, I think that, again, putting politics at the risk of being repetitive at the center of the agenda is warranted by the evolution of conflict that we're seeing in the trends. Two of which I think are, one is the increase in armed groups and the proliferation of armed groups, and the need to engage with actors outside of the state, but arguably these are political actors that exercise, leadership in their communities. And so I think a political approach is warranted. Another is the increase in one-sided violence against civilians and state-sponsored violence. And again, that is inherently political. So I think it is warranted by what we're seeing on the ground. And then I didn't entirely catch the last question, so I might let my colleagues get to that one.
Can I just jump on the political actor and in fragility, non-security? Because I think, one of the ways that I would think about it is, so let's say we're talking about the effects of climate change, or we're talking about livelihoods being no longer viable. And so in the first instance, the diagnosis of the problem may be fairly easy and technical, but then asking the government to respond to it may be actually quite problematic. So let's assume in the first instance they don't have any additional money, so where's the trade-offs? But let's assume in the second instance that the donors come in and say, here's all the money, we're gonna do the interventions. Well, what community needs to get that assistance? Is that community tied to the president's party or not? Is that a rival of another group? If they get a new livelihood, who do they displace? So there's all of these things that come with these interventions. They're not all just good. And thinking about sort of the various actors that are affected by this, by what is a genuinely, altruistic intervention, it does have political effects. And if you don't know who's rival with who, you don't know what constituents belong to who, you don't understand the time scales between the different elections or key periods or a history of an area, you're liable to sort of throw this, you may not get compliance, the money will be allocated and never spent, or it will be have this effect. And so I think it's building an understanding of the political ramifications, then working through it before you even do the engagement is how you can protect against sort of throwing good after bad.
I think on that question, I'll come back to that question again. In parts of Nigeria, what's happening between the farmers and the herders is basically climate change making it harder for them to find grazing ground and then encroaching on what was normally farmland. Again, politics is going to be there because they have leaders who are supposedly speaking on their behalf. So even for non-conflict related issues that happen because, even floods and droughts place significant pressure on scarce resources, and that will play out in politics, so I can see that. On the question of China's role in the world, China is now a $14 trillion economy. The US is $20 trillion economy. China's rise was accommodated by a framework international system that made it possible for China to trade and become wealthy. China has a responsibility to that system. So a framework that sort of shuts out China doesn't really, I mean, China, I can't imagine how it works in being able to do that. In terms of the multilateral development banks, I think we talked about even the World Bank having a fragile state outlook, African Development Bank having a fragile state outlook. I think the MDBs are themselves adjusting to this new reality. So, yeah.
The one thing I would add with regard to how you deal with fragility as opposed to conflict is around drivers and how you think about drivers in either impeding or advancing an agenda that creates fragility or staves it off. So how are you affecting grievances? How are you affecting inequity? How are you affecting the development of social capital? And how do you think about that when you're doing investments, whether it's in health sector, environment, governance, or other fields? And that will, by its nature, change the way you're approaching work in those areas if you're trying to prevent an exacerbation of fragility. I think the same will be true if you're talking about changing forms of conflict. How we see increasing roles for local civil society and local actors. How do you then augment that in ways that stave off fragility? We see technology playing a role in increasing ways around conflict, and what are the implications of that for non-local actors intervening. We see migration and different patterns of migration with implications for how you provide relief and then how you invest to build human capital for displaced populations. So there are lots of implications of changing nature of conflict and then how that affects your investments and the way you track critical investments. With regard to China, I'll put forward a very glass half full way of looking at it, which is I think that there are fundamental differences in the way China and the United States and others invest for development and to stave off fragility. And there's a lot of complementarity if there's an ability to overcome the sort of the lens or narrative of competitiveness. And so I think, I would say that there's a hopeful way to frame this that says these are different kinds of investments which are both necessary and independently are insufficient to really help end extreme poverty or bring about stable, prosperous states. And so I would hope that there can be that discussion which moves away from this competitive frame to say there's complementarity and synergy to be leveraged here.
And because you raised the issue of the multilateral development banks and what is the role for that too, I wanted to highlight some of the things that came out in the working group report about this too, in terms of sort of when the United States is thinking about its budgetary priorities and sort of the benefits that a multilateral system can really offer in terms of being able to share risks among different actors that are contributing to sort of this pooled funding kind of arrangement. There's also the idea of sort of political continuity. Often with changes of administration, you get different priorities that sort of rise and fall, but with multilateral banks, you can have some degree of continuity that is less beholden to a particular political system of any one country. And also multilateral development banks have the ability to pursue some more of the kinds of aid practices that can put countries in the driver's seat in a way that the US is sort of restricted from doing bilaterally. I do want to let Jim Scheer ask the final question because he was a member of our working group and we didn't get to him in the first round, and then we will conclude after that. So.
Thank you so much to our panelists and to the GCD more generally for this event. Quick comment and then an annoying question. Quick comment is I like the focus on politics because it speaks more to the causes of problems, not just the symptoms. And a lot of us who've worked on the humanitarian side know well the symptoms issue, but the causation is more challenging. My concern about politics is that it just becomes the national level. The regional and local levels are often left out. So, so I would just encourage that any discussion of politics takes a balanced approach on that. That's the comment. Question really on the security side, and Judy Moore may have some personal reflections on this given your public service time in Liberia, and that is, how do we balance the public and private sector partnership issues on civil engineering? Because if a lot of funding is going into the military sector to do civil works type issues, how do we build transparency so we avoid the sort of feeding corrupt practices problem, which is certainly true in states other than yours, but I've noticed it more broadly. It's a big challenge. I'm very much in favor of civil works engineering for multiple reasons, but the public-private issue is a challenge. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I'll let you speak to that, Jude, but
Well,
in the interest of time, we'll give you a short
just
minute. Yes.
really quickly. In instances where we actually turned to the military was just because the budget was short. So we inherited the infrastructure ministry was basically a force account. So the government itself did the work. At the end of the war, it became contracts management. It was mainly the private sector that was doing it. But in instances where you didn't have as much money and because the Army didn't get a profit, the Army doing it was cheaper than the private sector doing it. And in those instances where those were the instances where we got the military to do it.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank all of you for joining us today, for your participation in the two sections of this event today. I want to especially thank the working group, the 4 members of the panel up here, as well as the other members who are not on stage with us today. It was my professional privilege to be able to work with a group of such smart, talented individuals who have such deep expertise in a wide variety of these issues that relate to fragile states. And a lot of their brilliant ideas are captured in some of the work that we've done. They have many more brilliant ideas, and I look forward to following their work, as well as the broader conversation on fragile states as it continues to evolve. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Sarah.